Climbing in VR sucks. In this video, I'll be going over my solutions to create a better VR climbing experience and hopefully give you some good tips to make your climbing better as well. I've played games such as Half-Life Alyx, Boneworks, and The Walking Dead, and if you've ever played them, you know that climbing isn't their strong suits. So the first thing that I needed to do was sit down and figure out what's really wrong with climbing in all these games. After beating them all, I found that it came down to three key things: the strength or control when climbing, the collision detection, and being able to climb on top of objects. So how do we solve the problem of strength? Strength is really hard to solve because if you give too much control to the player, then the controls feel very lifeless and there's no swing or give or anything that you'd find in reality. But if you give too little control, like in Boneworks, you'll be penalized for moving too quickly, you'll be unable to perform certain moves, and it can feel really clunky and unresponsive. That being said, how do you solve this problem? I think the best way to do it is to have a physically based controller like Boneworks, but uncap the max speed and allow for a lot more control at higher speeds. The way that I did this is I used the formula 1 over x, x being the velocity of the controllers, and I applied it as drag. So when the player is moving the controllers very subtly or slow, there's a lot of drag being applied, so it feels very controlled like Half-Life Alyx. But on the other hand, when the controllers are being moved very quickly, there's very little drag, making it feel unresponsive, but since the player wants to move that quickly, it feels natural and it feels like they have a lot of control. Moving on to the second problem, which is collision. A lot of the times in games, you'll get stuck on things that you shouldn't get stuck on because you don't know where your feet are. And this is a really big problem for devs because you don't really know where the feet should be or where the player wants them to be because you can't read their mind. So they need to manually move their feet in VR, and that can be clunky and slow at times. So in order to get around this problem, I essentially only make the hands and head collide. This turns the player into a geodude, which is unrealistic, but it gives a lot of transparency when it comes to collision. Because as a player, you know that when you're moving around, you won't get stuck on things because the only things that can get you stuck are the things that are being tracked, which is your head and your hands. This creates a 100% transparent collision system, and it makes the experience overall much more enjoyable for the player. Moving on to our third problem, which is actually standing up after climbing. If we look at Half-Life Alyx again, the way that they do it is they simply just teleport you to the top of the ledge. This is really fast, the player doesn't really have to think about it, but it can feel kind of gamey, and it can break immersion. On the other hand, if we look at Boneworks, there's a lot of input. The player first has to raise their legs to their chest, pull themselves over the ledge, and then lower their legs again to finally stand up. So both these solutions aren't perfect. So again, we're going to try to take the middle ground. And the way that I do it in my game is I have an automatic standing system. So since the player's legs are already up from our last solution with the collision, what you want to do is you want to automatically lower those legs when the player is on top of a ledge. And the simplest way to do this is to cast a raycast out of the bottom of the head, and when it collides with the ground while climbing, the legs will then be lowered and the player will be brought to a standing position. This solution is really great because it solves the two problems. It doesn't break immersion because it all happens physically, and two, it doesn't require a lot of input. It only requires the player to move themselves over the ledge. There's one last thing that I'd like to add that isn't really related to VR climbing, but just VR in general. And I believe if you add this, your VR experience will be greatly increased. And that's the principle that if you push on an object, it'll actually push your player controller back. A good example of this is in Boneworks. If you push on a wall, your player will physically be moved back. I don't know really how to explain the feeling of doing this, but when you do that, you feel like you're actually in the world, like you physically are there. It doesn't feel like these walls are just kind of textures or polygons. It feels like a physical wall that you're pushing on. Finally, I'd just like to summarize the 4 points that I displayed here to make sure that your climbing in VR is really great. Number one, make sure that the strength is very controlled at low speeds, but also don't cap the player's speed when they're moving the controllers really quickly. Make sure that they have the freedom and control that they desire in your game. Number two, collision. Make sure that only the head and hands can collide when you're climbing in your game. That way the player doesn't have to guess whether or not they're going to hit an object and stop. Number three, make sure that the standing is immersive, but also fast at the same time. So basically do everything for the player, have an animation to stand back up instead of doing things like teleporting, but also don't make it clunky and cumbersome to try to stand. And finally, number 4, make sure that when the player pushes on an object, it pushes back on the player, so it feels like you're physically there. If you enjoyed this video and you learned something, make sure you comment, like, and subscribe for more videos just like this one. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.